truth is that the use of English is still increasing in business. So, if the French language is not so important in business, what is the point of teaching French for business? And I'm going to have an answer developed on 2 points. What do you mean by languages for business? Is it a language course in a business content? Or is it a business course in a specific country content? So that's the first question. And also, teaching languages for business. The question is to know, what do you teach? How do you approach it? Do you just describe business in a very instrumental, neutral way, without taking side, without reflecting on what are the consequences of business? Or you may also take the opportunity to use those languages for business as a way to develop critical thinking amongst your students. You ask them, what's the impact of business on societies? What is this company doing for the wider world? So those are the 2 aspects that I will try to develop. First, if you consider that languages for business is a language course in a business context. That is the traditional approach. That's usually how it is taught. So you put the focus on the language. It may not seem relevant in France, but still in France, the use of French still remains important. So you are still needing to use French in a French company. If you consider outside France, Francophone country, particularly in Africa, they may not be very comfortable with the use of English and may still prefer French, and the English may provoke sometimes hostile reactions. And the last thing is that a famous quote amongst the business people is that in France you may buy in English, but you will not sell in English. That is to say, if you want to make business, to sell things, you will need to use the language of the buyer, that is to say, French. So this is the case for sort of defending the language side of languages for business. Now the other side is to consider that language for business is a business course in a specific context, a specific national context like France, or it could be another context. So what you will do in this course, you will not focus on the language. You will focus on other aspects. For instance, intercultural management. How do you deal with people from such and such nationality? And that's an area which is called intercultural management. And those who are familiar with this area know that Hofstede is the famous researcher who has looked at this. In this sort of languages for business courses, you will look at the social, economic, legal, and cultural aspect. So, what's an economy like? What are the laws like? What is the role of trade unions? What is the role of centralization? So you see here, the content is much more important. You will look at employment law. What are the laws referring to business? You will look at business practices. How are the decisions made in a company? Are there negotiations? What is the role of the hierarchy? And last, what are the cultural aspects? What is the etiquette in a company? In the morning, do you arrive and do you shake hands to your colleagues? People do that very much in French companies. I'm not sure that you do that in British companies in the morning, arriving, saying hello, shaking hands with everybody. In France, you tend to do that quite a lot. So those emphases are about understanding people at work, about the way, the cultural aspects and the way they do business. So this is really the sort of content approach. So you see there are two approaches. Language for business, there are two ways to approach that. Either you focus on the language, and this is usually for language students. Most teachers can teach that. Most language teachers can take that because you will emphasize. The emphasis will be on language. You can start this in year 1, year 2, year 3, because the focus is on language. How do you teach that? In the target language. If you are teaching English for business, you will teach that in English. You will do oral and written work, and it will be quite practical. Problems with this is that some students may not be interested. They don't like business. I'm here to study language. I want to be a teacher of Spanish, of French, of German. I will never work in business. That's not interesting. So that's one of the issues that you come across quite often. Even here, some students who do business modules say, I'm not interested in business. I want to do language. And it may be also a bit intellectually boring for some, because the way it is taught is not very challenging. You know, how do you make an appointment, book a travel? You know, all the exercises that we know are usually not very challenging. And I've taken a book, so it's an old book, but it's really about this. You know, it's about sort of visiting France. You know, and it's supposed to be a business book. You know, and it's very limited in terms of content. So that's the traditional approach, which is the focus is on language in a business context. The other approach is to have a business course in a language context. That is to say, it's mainly for business students who want to do a bit more language. So this is really for a more specific audience, and usually they need prerequisites. They need to have a bit of business knowledge. They have studied business before. How do you do that? You will mix the languages. You will mix the languages, and sometimes you may do this entirely in English and not in French. They will be content. They will be research. You don't need to do research to book a train ticket, but you need to do research to know how companies work in a certain country. Issues staffing. Who are going to be the teachers able to teach the business side for such students? If I teach business in France, will this be useful for students who want to work outside France, in Francophone Africa? Maybe not, because the business attitudes, business practices will be different. And it may be not practical enough. You know, you study the French economy, the organization, students will say, well, it's too theoretical. So you see that both approaches are quite valid. What I suggest is to mix both approaches. That is to say, to have languages for business modules or classes which are both focusing on language and focusing on content. And Coventry University, I think, the way we do languages here is quite good, is that we try to mix languages and content. It is, in my opinion, a progressive approach, because you can start from year 1, you can start from the first year of studies at university. You don't need to know much about business. You can start really straight away. And it's comprehensive because you teach the language and the content. And for language studies, you can take account the year abroad or placement abroad. So what I'm going to do is to sort of explain how would be a program from year 1, year 2 to the final year and give you example. In year 1, you can put the emphasis on language. In year 2, the emphasis will be more on content. And in final year, you can move to more specialized modules with a mixture of semi-specialized content and language. Examples of year 1 business for language modules, an example of French. This is the traditional approach. What do? You insist on the language used in business. So what will you do? You will do written work, correspondence, how to write a business letter. You do a comprehension exercise. You read articles dealing about business. You can do a bit of translation. So those are always very classic activities. Oral comprehension, you interview a worker, try to understand what the worker was saying. You may have phone discussions, role-playing discussion between two persons. Role-playing, have a business meeting. You will have the head of the company, the marketing director, the finance director, so you can have a nice little business meeting. Job interviews, how do you apply to work in a company? Negotiating and organizing business trip. This is what you tend to do in most cases for language for business. So that's why I think this is a bit more for me in year 2. For year 1. Year 2, you start to look at the content of an economy. What's the business environment? What are the practices? For instance, business structures in France. What is the French economy like? How it developed? What are the political factors? So you see, you are much more in content here. You have to research, you have to understand, you have to go through academic readings. What is the French economy today? What is the public sector like? Is it important? What is the private sector like? Is it important? What are the issues? And the issues here, and that's what, in my opinion, is lacking in languages for business module, is that you don't really consider enough the issues of business for the wider society. What is the importance of unemployment? What is the importance of globalization? If a relocation happens, what is the effect of relocation? Poverty, how does it affect economy? What is the welfare state? So you see that you may start to have a critical approach with this sort of modules. Other example, and those are examples of what I do with my students, books which are very critical of the French economy. You see it's quite clear. Those who know a bit of France, the Eiffel Tower, France will have to sell the Eiffel Tower to survive. If we want to subsist, we'll have to sell the Eiffel Tower. So I'm asking the students, well, what does it say about the French economy if we have to sell the Eiffel Tower? And the other topic, the other book is La France qui tombe, France is falling. So you see, you start to bring a bit of content, a bit of critical approach on the subject. Other activities that you may do in those sort of content-based modules, looking at companies. Ask students to present a company. And for French companies, quite easy. L'Oréal, you've probably all heard about L'Oréal. I'm asking students to present L'Oréal. But it could be also Air France, Renault, Orange, which by the way is French, EDF, which by the way is French, LVMH, the luxury brand. So those are activities that students like very much, present a company. And also, you ask the students to be critical about the company. What is the human resource policy of the company? Is it good to work in this company? Or do the workers criticize the company? So you see, I'm not approaching business as something good. And that's the problem that you find in most of the books, is that the books say, well, business is good, don't think about it. No, you may think about the implication for society about business. So encourage a critical approach. And the students, at the beginning, will be a bit worried about that, but at the end, they like to talk about it. Last example of modules, business practices, in particular if the students are going abroad. For instance, what is the recruitment? If you want to work, what are the rules to be recruited? What is the law like? You know, working weeks. In France, it used to be 35 hours. If you go in another country, you may be asked to work 50 hours. So looking at the legal side, and all sorts of possible activities that you can do. I'm not going to insist. Now moving to the really, really interesting bit, final year language for business modules, where you really mixed language and content. Example of modules, and those do exist, either here or in other university. French for public relations and marketing communications. Advertising and marketing in French, we have this module here. French for tourism, French for human resources. So you see that you can have a rather semi-specialized approach with language and with content. And I'm going to give you an example of these modules. French for public relations and marketing communication. You will look at corporate communication, how the company presents itself. Crisis communication. A company has a crisis. How does it communicate on the crisis? So I gave you example, and I'll talk about this. Total is actually a French company, provoked a massive oil spill in Brittany and was responsible for the shipwreck. So the problem that Total had at this time is that the company did not communicate well. So activists used the advertisement of Total to make new advertisement criticizing Total. So this is what happened. That was a tanker, just sort of went into the bottom of the sea, and an oil spill. And you'll see there is plenty to say about this. With the language, you see that they play with the language. Totalement in French can mean either totally, but also it means total lies. So it's a play on word. This one is quite good. Total becomes fatal. So, you know, the students can study the language. This one is also excellent. Total becomes trop sale, too dirty in French. So you see, you can ask the students to really look at the language, and this is total becomes anéantissement total, so total collapse, you know. And you've got all sorts of ways to ask students to comment on this. So these are the sort of activities that you can have on a marketing, advertising, communication module. But for those who do English for business, I gave you quite a good example. Last year you had Tesco, who had the horse meat scandal, and asking the students to see how Tesco communicate on this crisis. So you look at, you know, Tesco did advertisements, Tesco wrote letters, they did interviews. So you see that you can mix the language and content, because obviously there is a problem for Tesco. why did we end up with this horsemeat scandal? Perhaps because the buying process was not very strict enough. And funnily enough, we had a very similar case to Tesco case in France years ago, and it was about the mad cow disease, meat coming from England, Britain, which was sold, whereas it was not allowed in France. And another example is a case, Air France had a plane crash, a plane Concorde crashed. How did the company communicate? So you see, you are mixing language and content, and you try to reflect on how the company present its case. Another example, which is happening currently, where you look at internal communication, how a company communicates with its own employees. And we've got very tragic cases in France at the moment. Two companies, very famous companies, Orange and Renault. The problem they have is that the employees commit suicide at work. And we are talking of a phenomenon, a rather large phenomenon. It's not 1-2 persons, we are talking of 10 to 20 people who commit suicide in companies. So really a terrible, terrible situation. And again, if employers trying to highlight the problems in this company, for those who know the format of this, if you buy cigarettes, you'll see that's the sort of message that you have on cigarettes packs saying that it's dangerous. And here the message is, travaillez-tu, to work will kill you. So obviously, you can start a debate about, is it really the point to work and end up, dead, basically. So here the focus will be more on internal communication. And an exercise that I've asked my students, it was not an easy one. I said to my students, you are the bosses of Orange or Renault. They are suicides in the company. Write a letter to your employees. So the students have to think about what they are going to say to the fellow employees, and they obviously have to do it in French. So I'm working on the language and the content, and trying to have the student being a bit critical. Last example, I'm using an ad from a company. It's come from Coca-Cola, and this is quite extraordinary. Coca-Cola in France claims it is fighting against obesity. So even if you don't have much knowledge about food or calories, etc., I'm not sure that Coca-Cola is the healthiest drink. If you want to get slim, I'm not sure that having a diet based on Coca-Cola is the best option. So this aims at asking students to think, why did Coca-Cola do that? Why did Coca-Cola need to make an ad saying, we are fighting against obesity? Are you really? So you see, you ask the students really to think, and to think in a critical way. So that's what I call the critical approach. Very often when colleagues hear that you teach language for business, they think, oh, you are on the business side. You are a Philistine. You are pro-business. Maybe not. And actually the students enjoy when you have this sort of critical side. Teaching languages for business is not a pro-business exercise. You can start to engage with issues raised about business. Moving now to one of my favorite exercises, it's more the creative side about business. This is quite a remarkable product. It's French. It's liquid salt. Salt normally is solid, but here you have a spray and you have a chicken and you go with salt. And it's a product which exists. So I'm asking my students to design a marketing plan to launch this product in the UK. And the people who are going to make the decision are fellow students. So they have 2 or 3 groups of students presenting a marketing plan, and you've got students who will have to give the market to one of the 2 groups. So this is more to emphasis on the creative side of languages for business. So to conclude, I think that the teaching of languages for business, French for business, can be useful and relevant, can be varied. You can do a lot of different things. It is an opportunity to practice all language skills. Written skills, oral comprehension skills, spoken skills. And you also have, and that's probably the key message, you have the opportunity to mix content and language. Try to put content. Because it's the opportunity to understand issues and societies. It can be critically oriented. It doesn't need to be pro-business. You don't need to be in favor of business. And hopefully it is interesting and hopefully a bit fun. And at the end of the day, even the students who are not convinced, they see the point and they like it.
Okay, thank you very much, Laurent. Are there any questions? Yes, Gordon.
I understand what you meant by first content for language for the first year, second year content, and then the eclectic in the third year. Now, how do you propose teaching the language if it is done in isolation from the content?
Well, that's what happens quite often. I've tried to describe it, is that very often you sort of learn how to book an appointment in a company. You try to read how the company is organized. You know, you will have those documents. I mean, if you want to know how it's done, I mean, this sort of book is quite a typical example. And if you see most of the language for business book, they don't have content. They very often are descriptive, instrumental. It's about learning the language, not really understanding the economy.
I was of the opinion that I thought language and content would be interwoven.
That's what I'm trying to defend.
This could be a good dissertation, Coldrick. You're analysing English for business textbooks, which ones have language and content together, which ones are more descriptive, and
Go to the language center. Look at the language for business books. Most of them have a sort of instrumental approach. You know you learn the vocabulary.
Okay. In your opinion, would you say is it not time that we moved from that kind of approach to a more authentic?
No, that's what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is that it's perhaps difficult to do that, although we do that here, to be honest. But it's difficult to do that immediately in year 1. In year 1, students will be perhaps, year 1 students are a bit insecure. If you are telling them that you are to look quite in detail into the economy, etc., they may be straight. They may be a bit afraid. If you tell them, okay, what is the language of business, they will be more comfortable. However, I'm entirely I share your point, and that's what I do. I start in year 1 by trying to mix language and content. But this is the safe approach. Putting content from year 1 to students who may not be too confident may scare them a bit. But I agree. The sooner the better. The sooner you mix both, the better.
Isn't there a case here for some sort of... Sorry, or was there another question?
No.
Yeah. Some immersion In the culture, is there any way you can do that so that students come into university and they're immersed in the French language and the culture? How could you establish that? You know, I'm thinking perhaps sections of the building that are French only.
So before they
Yeah.
arrive at university?
No, no, no. When they come in the morning or whatever for their class.
Or what sort of activities they could do outside classes to...
Well, yeah, but outside of classes. But I'm saying that, you know, if you could sort of create some sort of area where they feel as if they're being immersed in the language and the culture of France. It's very difficult to teach the language of French in Britain, isn't it? That's what I'm saying. So I'm just saying, could you... You know, we used to do this in Korea. We had English-only offices and building virtually.
That's a good idea.
Yeah, I'm just thinking if you can immerse.
Shina, could we have a French...
We have a French office.
A French office?
Yeah, well, not maybe just a few offices or something. I mean, you know, maybe we can grab the JED building,
I
the
may
rooms down.
intervene because I do Spanish for business.
Yeah,
What I have done through years of doing this is to try to get the students into practicing and also to feel that they are doing something that has some relation with real life.
yeah,
And that is by simulations
yeah,
and by giving them tasks that they have to perform by using the language they are learning, by using the knowledge about, you start with companies usually because it's simpler regarding vocabulary, and then you build up for those texts another context
yeah,
for which that vocabulary is primordial in order to understand what's going on in a more content-based approach. And is the way to bring reality to the classroom.
yeah, yeah. Simulations, yeah, I've done them.
I'm going to disagree with Mike. Sorry, Mike. In the globalized world, is there still room for Hofstede and for nationalistic perceptions of culture when people have to work with people from all over the world in all companies? So in terms of criticality, shouldn't you not also prepare these students? Yes, you need to teach the French situation, but in that French company, there would be a lot of people working from various places in the world. So I wonder whether we should move to the third way and consider not just one culture or the other. You have to teach the language fine, and it's okay, but is immersion, I don't think immersion is a solution. But this is, I'm stimulating your critical thinking.
No. Well, it's all the point to know whether with globalization we are moving to one culture.
Not necessarily.
Well, that's what you may suggest, is that we need to, we have a sort of minimum common way of behaving together. We keep our differences, but we have a sort of level playing field.
What worries me about just doing Hofstede approach and the cultural stereotype, it tends to go towards stereotyping. And I like what you do because you see it more broadly. And so I find a lot of these stereotypes, and you don't do this in France, you don't do that in England, and you do. But then in that company, Renault and Orange, I mean, you have people from all over the world who probably have very different approaches to their work there. So it's quite a difficult one to crack in business these days.
Yeah. Ideally, you need both. Ideally, you need to have the skills to deal with all sort of nationalities. Plus, you have the specific knowledge of a specific country or nationality.
I may add to what you said. Hosted is a bit old-fashioned now.
Yeah.
Yes,
Although his latest book is from 2010.
Yeah, hosted approach was very much based on the research he did for multinationals. Because they wanted to find out how they could deal with all these different nationalities and ways of thinking about the world. Trepanard is probably a far more up-to-date approach, in as far as we have to stop thinking on stereotypes and thinking of the fluidity of human relationships and how to manage that fluidity.
Yeah. There was a question from Andrew.
Yeah, it's kind of related to those points really about the globalisation and French in the international form, if you like. And I mean, what you're suggesting are some great activities, Laurent. I wondered if you're restricting it by sort of focusing on France as its European context, and perhaps you mentioned the Francophone countries, that a lot of people doing business might want to, they may end up in Africa or want to communicate in the Cameroon or the Senegal or other French-speaking parts of the world. I wonder if you would incorporate
I think
aspects in your plan.
I've mentioned that this was a staffing issue, is that I'm quite comfortable to teach about content about business in France. I must admit I have no knowledge about business in Francophone countries. So ideally, yes, but you go back to the sort of multicultural, you know, ability to adapt. But that's a staffing problem. Ideally, you should have somebody who is both able to relate with the Francophone world. As for
and if you have perhaps you could research on some of the key issues, and there may be students actually who may have more insights possibly. So
and very often, you know, students from Francophone background from Africa will say, well, that's the way we do things, you know, the negotiations tend to be much longer, much more complicated, or they say, you know, that, and then you move. But then Ørsted is interesting because Ørsted gives you a sort of map, what you look at, you know, what are the, that's why he was quite, he will look at the hierarchical distance, you know. Is it difficult to talk to your boss in a company? In France, it's very difficult. In Britain, it's quite easy. So Ørsted gives you a sort of map to understand what are the cultural elements which you may consider in a company. So with this you can approach maybe Francophone country, and it's true that the students who know that will intervene, but to be honest, as it's not my area of expertise, I'm not going to start telling, well, if you go to Africa, you should do business this way, or...
I suppose it might be just raising awareness.
Oh, yeah, you raise
some of the issues. I had a second question that's not related to that, and I'm just curious, when you actually deliver your classes, what are your views on using L1 and L2? I mean, obviously teaching French.
I try to be entirely in French.
Okay. And does that work here? Is that effective?
Yes.
Yeah, it gets
for you it is.
Yeah. Colin.
I think Rosario has the same approach.
I speak in Spanish. From time to time there may be the
From
need
time to time.
to explain, to translate, but the students rather prefer
lectures
for the target language to be used.
But that's the whole point of immersing them, isn't it? But the problem is when they come out of the classroom, they switch straight back into English. So you've got to try and find ways to actually get them to...
But I think, you know, that I exactly have the same approach. I try to do it entirely in French. When you feel, you know, when you are a teacher, you tend to have a bit of experience. When you feel that they don't get it, they look a bit lost, then okay, you say, well, maybe you didn't get that, and you move to their language and you explain it. So it's a matter of, you don't have to be too rigid, I think. Yeah. If you are 100% French or 100% Spanish, after 15 minutes, you may lose your students. So, but from time to time, if there is a problem.
I think we'll take the last two questions, one from Colin and one from Sheena. I think Colin was first.
Yeah, I think you said at the beginning of your talk that you're particularly interested in exploring the relationship between business and society and the impact. And I suppose that leads on to questions of politics.
Absolutely.
Because, I mean, I see there, you've got pro-business, and then you've got anti-business. Well, they're politically charged phrases.
Absolutely.
Now, I wonder to what extent you can incorporate that in your languages for business modules, or whether you revisit that in another form in your final year 332 Dell module on contemporary France. Because I mean,
that's a very good question, is that how much can you be political on this sort of modules? And it's very funny, and I was about to ask one of my students to come, because one of my students said, well, you are so anti-business.
It's kind of obvious.
And I don't know, apparently I seem to hate Total. Actually, I didn't know. And they say, you Total, you hate Total. What's your problem with Total? And I don't have a particular problem with Total, but you know, they perceive it. So really, it's a good question about how far can you go. I try to let them discuss. I try to say, okay, Total, clearly they wrecked the environment, and then have a little debate. You know, is it normal that employees commit suicide in a company? What does it say about the company? And the students will say, probably not a great company, you know. So I try to let them develop, but it's true that there is a risk. You can become very political. I'm not anti-business either, you know, I don't want to give this message.
Okay.
Sorry,
Rosario, this is Sheena.
That you were pro-business and you wanted to make it a bit more balanced.
The problem is that when you start these sort of classes, students think you are pro-business. If you are a languages for business teacher, they think, oh, you are a Philistine. That's what they think. And colleagues also think that. So in a way, maybe I'm trying to work too far in the other direction to put a bit of distance.
Yes, Sheena.
The question has to do with the role of business knowledge and business modules and business content, and whether if you ask people to design a marketing plan to launch Sell Liquid, if they already know about marketing, they'll do it in one way, and you risk by not teaching the marketing of having more superficial sort of content from the students, and how you see those two playing together.
Or actually, they would have, before this activity, a class about how to design a marketing plan.
From you?
Yes.
Okay, so then you're doing this all independently?
Oh yeah, no, this is an activity. I'm not asking them to invent a marketing plan if they never. So they would have had a lecture about what is a marketing plan, you know, the 4 Ps, you know, the product, the price. So they have the teaching. No, you don't leave them.
So if they are doing the business modules, they would be having that in English in the business school,
yes,
and in French.
And they'll have an advantage.
Yes,
that's true.
No, I'm just wondering how it works. You don't rely on them.
Oh no! You have to teach.
Yeah.
That's why it's a staffing issue. You need to have a bit of knowledge. If you want to do a marketing exercise, you have to know the basic of marketing. If you want to teach, I don't know, human resources, that's why I call them semi-specialized. You don't need to be an expert.
Resources and how to address people in times of suicide as well.
Yeah, that's actually the students did a wonderful letter. Wonderful. So it was a bit heavy, but the letter they did was excellent. The sensitivity, really, they did really well. I think they got a first.
Right, Janet has the last question. That's the last question
The
then.
critical approach is obviously great. It's getting them to think, to question, to analyse and to see things more broadly. And it's also obviously skills that they can transfer to other contexts, without the national context, to other companies. Transferable, I really use the word. I just wondered how critical, is there a critical approach, do you think, in their other business modules? Either in the UK or in France? You know, do you think? Or do you think this is something that they have to sort of learn to be a bit more critical with you, I suspect?
It depends on the teacher, I think.
Yeah.
Some teachers who teach. Actually, I had François Hollande as a teacher of economy, and at this time he was not presenting socialist ideas.
Did he come in on a scooter?
Not at that time.
Can I just say there is we are very interested in cultural dimension. I'd like to conclude by saying it's a very culturally marked approach in your approach to teaching business languages for business, which is very French, I think, very critical, and very liberté, fraternité, égalité.
You're very French.
Yeah, it is a revolutionary way.
But no, I don't want, again.
No, but
because
it is.
You are perceived. If you, again, I say that to future teachers. If you are going to teach later, and if you say that you do English for business, you will appear as a business person.
Yeah. No, it's very interesting.
And there are all sorts of assumptions about that.
No, it's very interesting because I doubt many people in William Morris will approach it this way. So actually,
we almost have a philosophical approach to business, which is very.
But again, I don't want to give you the idea that I'm anti-business.
No.
But you already given it to us, so there's no point in denying. Anyway, thank you very much, Laurent. Very special. very stimulating.